Welcome to the second module of Bootstrap 4 by example. In this module, we'll get started by actually using Bootstrap to start to form sections of our website. Let's get started. So when getting started with Bootstrap 4, CSS classes are the key to how most of Bootstrap 4 works. You'll apply CSS classes to elements on the page. Bootstrap purposely doesn't automatically change much in the way of your style until you use these classes, so that if you're trying to mix and match Bootstrap with other techniques, you don't have collision. In many cases, more than one class is required, and so if you're used to just using one class and applying all the CSS rules in it, Bootstrap may be a little weird at first, but I think you'll get used to it pretty quickly. Most of this course is going to focus on using a class to do a lot of the work instead of writing your own CSS. That doesn't mean at the end of the day you shouldn't be writing some CSS to customize the look and feel of Bootstrap to make it look like your own. We're going to start by talking a bit about layout in Bootstrap. The idea in Bootstrap is to help you make a malleable layout that can react to the different screen sizes or the different devices you're going to be working with. You have to buy into this philosophy of grids. This allows you to specify how big something is on a specific device size, as well as how much of the page it should take. Let's dig in with some real code. So let's start with some simple CSS classes that are included in Bootstrap 4. Let's start by opening up index.html, and if we come down to the first story, this section main includes all the stories, so we're actually looking for the div that has the ID of lead. This first story is the lead on the website page. Before we make a change here, remember you're going to need to open a console and type npm start to have it actually serving our web page in the browser again. So back to the index.html code, we come down here to that message list. Let's go ahead and add some classes here that will allow us to format what this message looks like. Let's start by just saying border. Border is a simple class that simply draws a border around an element. In this case, it's around the planets. We can also use bg-, which is for background, for a small number of colors. And these colors are based on some ideas that Bootstrap has about standard colors: primary, secondary, warning, info, etc. So let's start with primary as the background color. The idea behind having these named colors is that as your theme changes, different parts of the Bootstrap framework have the same sort of color scheme for the different names. So here the background for primary is actually blue by default in Bootstrap, assuming you haven't made any changes there. Blue isn't a good option because it's also the same color we're using for links at this point. So let's actually change this to secondary. We can see the secondary color is gray. Also not a great option. So let's go to info. We can see that's sort of a taupe. Later, when we look at theming of Bootstrap, you'll see how using these named elements, when you take a theme that is out in the wild that can help change the look and feel of your website, these colors may also change. And if you use them, they'll be applied to the rest of the website in a uniform way. I'm going to go ahead and take off the background for now, and let's use a couple other helpers that are interesting. The first one I'll show you is P. There are classes out there for P that from 1 to 5 will allow you to add small changes. And they have a number of these. P is for padding, M is for margin. So let's go ahead and do something like padding of 4. And we can see that's added an amount of padding around our planets. Now this 4 doesn't indicate purely a pixel, it's more of a unit inside of Bootstrap. And if we do the same thing with M, let's say 4, we'll see that it's created quite a large margin around here. And the idea behind these is to eliminate the need to create individual classes that are going to just do some of these small changes. So you can do some ad hoc changes as necessary to tweak your design without dropping down into writing one more CSS rule. Both of these support using MT for top, left, B for bottom, and R for right, so that you can specify very specific margin requests. So in our case, I'm going to say margin left and margin right of 4, but we'll keep the top and the bottom margin at nothing, and I'll leave the padding at 2. We can see we're now getting the margin on the right and the left, but it collapsed the margin we had added to the top and the bottom. Another thing we can do is use W and H. So W is what the width is in percentages. So if I change this to width 50, we can see it's now half the size of the page. Width 25, quarter the size of the page. Now if we do 100, it'll take the entire page width, even though it's still going to be changed by the margins we had added. All of these widths and margins are going to be as they're related to the container they're in. Because the container is that actual class container, it's going to try to make it the width of the entire page. Later on, we'll see that making something width inside of something that might be floated right or left, or maybe part of a table, is going to change that. It'll be the width within the container, not the width of the browser window itself. So we can get rid of width 100 because we'll actually make a change a little later that will affect that. If we add a float right here, that does exactly what it says, and that is set the float to right. So if we look here, we'll see our planets element is here, and not only is it to the right of these asteroids and stars, but it's actually on the same plane as it. And float is going to allow us to have text and such wrap around anything that's floated. This is a pretty easy way with float left, if we see this, to create our element and then have other things flow on the right side of it as well. It's going to support both methods. So let's go ahead and take what we have, all of these, and just apply them to all 4 messages. In this way, we should be able to create something like just a little bar full of links that might be a little bit more appealing. There are better ways of doing this in Bootstrap, but this will be a good way to get started with just the simple CSS classes. And now we have these floating out in the way we want, but of course our next element is going to react to these floating elements because they're this large and try to wrap around them. Because it's a big image and a header, the first 2 are getting stuck to the right of that. The trick here is to really go to the div that contains all of these pieces and tell it that we want it to treat all of these messages as their own row, so that it's going to take up most of the horizontal space in our website, again within that container. So we're not going to use message list as a class anymore. Let's replace this with something called row. And row is that piece that'll tell it to take all the horizontal space. So now we have Space is Amazing, Welcome to the Planet, we have our little sort of button looking links here, and then we have the rest of the website continuing to act just like it always has. And like before, we're going to see that as we get into the smaller and smaller browser sizes for mobile devices, this is going to try to do the best it can, and that is to simply take these floated items and wrap them if necessary. But it's always going to treat this entire section as a row, so the things above and below it won't be influenced by any changes we make to layout here. So let's look at layout next. So now let's look at some display helpers. We talked about using this float left here inside of the message buttons, but let's come down to our first story and look at the way we're using this first image. We're using the old class right, but instead let's do like we did before and say float right. We can see we can now make the image float to the right and then the rest of the story gather around it, which is certainly a better look and feel. If we come back and add a new class called image thumbnail, we'll see that it adds a pleasant border around it and a little padding so it doesn't run into the text quite as easily. You can certainly create your own classes for this, but this makes a pretty easy way of handling it. We can see if we change the sizes again, that these floated items are only floated in the large sizes. You'll notice because we've applied this, it's actually resizing it as the browser window gets smaller, but this floating that causes the wraparound only happens when we're not in certain resolutions. And because the image is so big, it's really getting in the way when we're in even smaller resolutions like on a phone. You know, this might be interesting to see, but we like to be able to look at the text a little more. So one of the options here is to use a set of classes called D for display, and one of the options here is D none. And in that case, we'll see that the image just simply disappears. But it disappears in all cases, so all we're doing is hiding it. We're not hiding it in certain resolutions. And so this is one of the first places you'll start to see the ability to do things with classes that apply to certain breakpoints in our mobile-first responsive design. So D none is interesting, but what if I wanted to actually say this was going to be display inline, which is a display type, or block? I can very quickly add these to elements that may not be block or inline or even inline block to make that happen without, again, having to write your own CSS. But it becomes more interesting if we include, let's say, let's hide it in all cases, but let's also include the options of showing it in certain resolutions. So the D none will take over and hide it in all different resolutions, and then we can say D-XL for extra large, let's make it block, and then D-LG for large, let's also make it block. So we're specifying that none is the default, and then block is going to be used for extra large and large breakpoints in our responsiveness. If we come back to the browser, we can now see that it's gone, but as we start to increase, once we start to hit that large and extra large, we'll see those breakpoints actually happen. But as we shrink it, it goes away. So this gives you the ability to hide and show things depending on the size of the screen that it's being shown in. So you can make something be small and very concise on a tablet or a phone, but then when we get to a browser-sized browser, we can go ahead and have it as verbose as we want. So next, let's talk a little bit about Flexbox. So let's talk about Flexbox. Flexbox is a new layout mechanic that's supported by modern browsers. And in order to get into this new mechanic, you have to set the display as Flexbox so the things inside of a container can react to the Flexbox rules. Flexbox is built to support more sorts of functionality in layout. This is sort of the next evolution. We started with table-based layout when we really didn't have any other choice, and then we went to div and float-based layout that a lot of things, including Bootstrap, are based on, and Flexbox is the maturation of the new ideas about layout. It includes some interesting features like automatic rows and columns, different alignment strategies, and it's more powerful than the current layout. But the topic is just too large to handle in this course, so I'm going to specifically talk about the Flexbox support and Bootstrap itself. The one drawback of Flexbox is it does not have backward compatibility or even decent shims for it to support older browsers. So you're going to want to make sure that you're only using Flexbox when you know you're going to be on the latest browsers. Let's see how you can use these helpers. Back in index.html, let's go down to the bottom. So near the bottom, we have these 4 icons that we're showing. On the web page, you can see them all the way at the bottom of our page here. 4 large icons. And I want to use them as an example for using Flexbox Layout. The first thing I need to do is make sure the parent element has the class. And if we do d-flex here, this is going to tell the container to use display Flexbox for its layout. If you remember from the last video, we're using this to show display none or display block or even display inline in order to set that display type. In this case, we can just say dflex for display Flexbox. So one of the things that Flexbox supports is the idea of rows and columns. So inside this container, we can tell it to use rows or columns, but by default, it will show them as individual columns, which is why they're marked left to right. If we add flex column here, we'll tell it to use this collection here as a single column of entries, which we can see here in the browser. But let's leave it at row. What we'd want to do here is to tell it how we want to lay out this row. Remember that the row is just smashing them all together as far as it can, left justified because our text goes left to right. So if we add justify, content, and say we want it at the end, the browser, it'll move it all to the right hand, just like if we had set them all to float. We can also tell it that instead of end, to choose start, and that's the default behavior it has with the start. You can also say between, which will put them as stretched far between each other as possible. And you can also say around. The difference between and around is that it centers each like it has space around them, not just the space between them. The language it's using of start and around and between is very specific. Because if we change this to flex column, and we specify the height of this, it would do the same thing beginning and end. So let's see what this looks like. So we can see here it's giving that same around behavior. And if we do between, we'll see that it's doing that same behavior on a column as it would a row. And so we don't have the same ideas of stretch left to right or top and bottom. We're really saying we're in a row or we're in a column, and we're going to use these justifications that are more natural to whether they're rows or columns. This is just a taste of some of the Flexbox support in Bootstrap 4, but if you're already in that Flexbox world and you can guarantee that you're going to be on browsers that support it, on the latest Chrome or Edge or mobile browsers, then you can really dig in and use Flexbox instead of some of the other techniques we're going to show you. So if you've used Bootstrap before, you're probably already familiar with its grid system, but let's talk about it in the way that most developers use the grid system. The idea behind the Bootstrap grid, or most grid systems in the web, is to divide the available space that you're working with into 12 logical units, so that you could have a column that's 6 wide, a column that's 6 wide, and when you put them together, they're going to take up an entire row. And when you say 4 wide, you're taking really 4 of the 12 logical units that are available. The same way you could do 3 wide or 2 wide to really decide how much of the grid you want a particular element or container to take up. you can mix and match them. So 9 and 3 go together to make 12, 8 and 4 make 12, 6 and 5 make 11. But what if we then had another element here, like a 3? The way the grid system works, because 3 doesn't fit in the 12 anymore, it go ahead and wraps it to the next level. So you could imagine a design where you had just an endless number of 4s, and as many 4s that would fit on a line, if you want to think about it in that way, or on a row. It would show those columns as 3 columns on the page, and then do the same with the next 3, and the next 3, and the next 3. And so in this way, you're really helping calculate how much of the screen you want. At first, this can be a little confusing because you think about, the idea of 4, and you might think about it dividing it as 25% of each row. But really 4 is a third because we're dealing with 12 grid units. So 4 would be a third of 12. 3 would be a quarter of 12. Let's see how this grid works. If we remember it originally, we had really 2 pieces here. We had a bunch of content on the left, and then we had a sidebar on the right. In fact, in the code, we have this segmented in this main section. We have a main section and a sidebar section, and we'd like to make them side by side. So if we wrap these in a div, we can then say this top section is going to be class of column, and then we're going to choose a size, and I'll talk about sizing soon, but I'll just say medium for now. And let's say 6. Let me collapse these so we can put them really together. And we'll do the same thing here, 6 for the sidebar. Going back to the browser here, we can see that we have the spacing of this now at 6 because it's taking up half the page, but our sidebar here is still sitting here, also sized at 6. Why is that? The reason is, in order to use the grid system, we have to start the container out with something called a row. A row says that we're going to treat each of these as not just sizing it to half a page, but we want to treat them as a single row together. Because again, this grid of 12 is within a container. It's not a grid of 12 across the entire page unless the container is using the entire page. So you can actually nest these where you're still using that grid of 12 within each other's sections. And I'll show you some examples of that as we go on. So with the row in there, we can now see that the main content is here and the sidebar is here, and that's about 50-50, and that's going to be, for the most part, the same no matter what size our page is. The sizing of them isn't going to matter as much. But let's go back, and what if we made these more like 75% and 25%? Again, we're getting that because the 9 in the column is 9 out of 12 is about 75% of 12, and 3 out of 12 is about 25% of 12. We come back here and we're closer to what we had in the beginning. We have a sidebar that takes up some part of the page and then this much larger section of our actual content. And regardless of what size we do, the way the columns work is they're going to try to maintain that 75-25 as we change the size of the site. But you notice once we get to a certain size that is small or extra small, or if you want to think about it as tablet or smartphone, that it still puts them top and bottom. That's because we have some rules in Bootstrap by default that it knows that once you're on a smaller size screen, that putting them left to right would really be cramped unless you want to do something special. You can override that, and we'll see how that works in a minute. Next, let's talk about a new feature in Bootstrap 4, automatic columns. A new feature in Bootstrap 4 is the idea of automatic grids. And this is where it's going to basically allow you to specify a bunch of containers, and however many containers there are in there, it'll spread them out within a single row. For example, if we start with just the row element like we saw before, and we just have 2 things that are classed as just column, we're going to get 2 elements. But if we have 3 of them, we'll get 3 elements. 4, and 4, and etc. So the idea here is that it would take the number of things inside of a grid to determine how to break these up. This is where you really just want evenly spaced objects. This doesn't have to be row upon row. You can also support a row that has, all of this data in here. And then you might have 2 columns. And if you separate them by something that you specify as just width 100 or 100%, this breaker isn't going to be visible, but then the next elements are going to do that split among the number of columns in that container as well. So you can do this to have mixed set of columns and rows so that as you add new .cols, they're going to be automatically calculated for you. And this can be really useful in some cases. If you don't want evenly spaced columns, you'll still want to use the column sizing and the 12 grid like we talked about before. Let's see how this works. So let's go down to the bottom of the main section. And if you remember this Flexbox, we're just going to add a section underneath it, just so we can show what we're looking at. I'm going to create a div here whose class is row, just like we did before. And if I have a new div whose class is a column, and the word 1 here is just so we have some text to show. And I'll go ahead and add border and text center so we can actually see what this looks like. If we look at the browser, we can see here that it's created one cell in our row, really one column in our row. If we come back here and just copy a second one, we can see that there's now 2. And unsurprisingly, 3 also shows 3, even if I could spell 3 correctly. But if I then had a div with width 100 and just copied a couple of these afterwards, this will become the invisible break between the calculation of those automatic columns. So now we can see that we have 1, 2, 3. We have that break, which you can't really see. And then the next 1 and 2 columns are then split the correct way they want to be. This can be a very useful way to make unending lists. You might imagine the way to make products in an e-store or listing albums in your collection website, wherever it may be, to have this sort of endless self-calculating column. But you do need to specify how you want to select these. Unlike wrapping over in rows, the more rows you add without knowing where that divider is, the higher number of elements on a single row that you're going to get. So there's some cases where this is absolutely perfect. You can imagine like navigation buttons, but other cases like a product list, it just really falls apart. Bootstrap supports the idea of multiple grids. The idea is that you have a grid for each type of screen size. By just using column and then a number, it's going to automatically make it across all the screen sizes. But as you want to specify, you can have column small, medium, large, and extra large. And in this way, you're going to specify what the column you want to use based on those different screen size breaks that we've been talking about in mobile development. So let's show an example. So let's say we've specified column large, column medium, and column small in this case, 7, 6, and 12. Because we're on the desktop, we're getting 7 and 5 because this is using the large. But here on a tablet, we're going to end up using the medium at 6 and 6, even though these are still all the classes we're using on our element. And in the case of small, you can see that it would just default back to 12 and then wrap for the second column. So let's see that in action. If we go back to index.html, and let's collapse our main again, and we use medium, which is going to be used for fairly small-sized screens. We can also do column large, and let's do this at 10 and 2. And so you notice that we have these sort of matching. This is going to equal 12, and this is going to equal 12. Just the sizing is going to be different. So here in the browser, we can see that we're getting a pretty large section and then a fairly small section. And this is actually showing it at the extra large size, but we didn't specify extra large. Here at the large size, we're also getting that 10 and 2. And the reason we're getting that is that effectively large is saying, make it 10 and 2 for large and larger. Because we haven't specified anything for XL, it's adopting that. And in fact, that happens on the smaller side as well. But let's make this a little smaller to hit the medium size, and you'll see that relatively the sizes have changed. So this is more like the 9 and 3 that we had a minute ago. And by default, once we break that, like we saw earlier, we're actually going to see that it's going to fall down into 12. Let's change that. Let's say for column small, let's make it 6 and 6. So on a tablet, for example, we're going to go from that 9 and 3 to an even split of 6 and 6. Again, depending on what you're building, this may not be exactly what you want. And then if you want to really specify what it is on a smartphone, you'll just use column. Because again, this is mobile first, and so the default column will be extra small, and then the rest will specify as we get larger. So if we went ahead and just said 12, or let's say 4 and 8, then we went from the 6 and 6 to actually having the sidebar even smaller once we hit that breakpoint at a cell phone size. Obviously, you probably would never use this in practicality because it looks just awful. But you can see how the sizing is working to help us figure these things out. I'm going to come back and get rid of the small and default size because I really want to leave those at 12 and 12 to make our application actually look pretty good in the browser. So here on the small devices, we're going to get them stacked, and then 9 and 3, and then the rest are going to be 10 and 2. And that's a good place to start. One thing you'll notice is that our column may only be this large, but we're having our images float way over. They're just too big. And one of the tricks there, as we sort of talked about in an earlier video, is let's go down to our sidebar and let's just add class image fluid. It's going to tell it to make sure that the images stay within the boundaries of the column we've specified. Now we can see that they've been made much smaller because in fact our column is only that wide. The search bar also will need to be specified so that it actually fits in this, but we'll get to that a little later. So now let's talk about another feature of the grid, offsets. Back at the top of index.html, we find this lead section that we worked with earlier. Let's go ahead and change it from ID lead to class column 8. If we go to the browser, we can see it's actually sized to 8, which is great. But this sizing of 8 isn't the same as the sizing of the whole column, and that's because this is nested inside of this column. This is giving us the 8 wide within the column above it. But 8 isn't exactly what we want here. We'd like to have it front and center, but centered. So the idea of centering introduces us to the concept of offset. So offset is going to allow us to say offset for one of our breakpoints, and I'll stick with medium for now. And we're going to say skip this many columns. So basically make an empty placeholder before this to push our whole content over. So let's say make it an offset of 2. That's going to take this lead section and make it centered within the main column here that we already had specified. And the power of what we're doing here is saying that we have an offset of 2 here and we don't need the other offset because whatever is over here is going to go ahead and scroll down to the next row anyway. This allows us to use the offsets. Again, the offsets are going to go with the columns to talk about skipping a section of the grid without having to create just empty divs everywhere. Just allows us to push it over one way or another. And this can allow you to do things like creating gutters and things. You could imagine having, column 9 and 2 and then using an offset of 1 before the column of 2 so that you had a space in between them instead of having to get down into CSS and start pushing them around or adding odd borders. Offset is the thing that allows you to do that. And just like the others, there's an offset 2, which is going to be for phone sized, and then has all of the same SM, MD, LG, and XL, just like the columns actually have. And you would very commonly have these as pairs. So if I did MD2, I might decide on extra large to make this 6 and 3. Well, why 6 and 3? 8 and 2 equals 10, 6 and 3 equal 9. I'm getting a little confused. And the idea here is that we want it to be 6 wide, but we want it to be centered. So 12 columns in the grid minus 6 leaves us 6, and half of 6 is 3. So we're moving it over 3 and leaving the rest as 6. And let's make sure this is XL before I show you the wrong thing. So if we look at this at full screen, we're going to see it's very centered. And then as we get smaller, as the columns change, we're also saying use more of the space here. And so we can really tweak our design to be exactly what we want. Again, you'll notice below medium, we're using the entire grid just like we did in some of the others. And so this is really giving us that opportunity to empower how we're going to do the layout of our website. That's really what the grid is for. If you look at automatic columns, if you look at sized columns, offsets, and the different breakpoints all put together, really gives you a lot of power to do this sizing without having to get down to pixel perfect or into writing a lot of CSS to do the math. After promising you didn't have to do a lot of CSS, let's look at the next topic to look at how we can actually customize what Bootstrap is actually doing. Let's talk about theming your Bootstrap. If you remember up at the top of our index.html, we have this site-specific CSS that we had commented out. Let's actually open that. And I'm going to leave all this old code here, which you probably should never do, and just write some CSS rules on the top of it. So even though the background of our website is white by default, or might even be blank, we can go ahead and create a rule. Let's do that for container. Remember, container is that class that wraps the entire website for us so that it is centered inside of the browser. And let's go ahead and set the background color to be a pleasing, let's say gray, just so we can see it actually working. We can see where the container is going to be actually gray now. And here you can really see how the element of the search bar is still sticking over. And again, we'll fix that a little later. And so what we've effectively done here is affect the way that Bootstrap looks, but not violating any of their rules. And the reason this works is cascading. So I'm going to make a quick assumption that maybe you haven't dived into the way that cascading style sheets works. And this is why the theming becomes important. When we look at something like this class container, this is the thing we wrote the rule for, we can see that container is specified in a bunch of different areas. And they cascade in that we have these different pieces of the CSS, but we really haven't figured out which one wins. And the way it works is that more specific rules win over less specific rules, and later rules win over earlier rules. So the rule we wrote actually is the last thing to be applied before the element. And the reason that is we made sure that under index.html that this site CSS was after the bootstrap. So as long as the specificity of the rule, which .container is as specific as it needs to be, is after, it will always overwrite what Bootstrap wants to do. But you may have noticed there's a bunch of containers, all from this grid SES, which is actually Bootstrap source code. Why do some of them get nullified and not others? And the reason you can kind of tell with these min-width declarations. This is actually the way that Bootstrap works in this case. When the container is defaulted to 100% width, the whole size of the browser, that is actually for phone sized. And then when we get up here to tablet size, it's saying as long as the width is at least 576, so you have a fairly large size phone or probably a tablet, then let's go ahead and make the width 540, so it'll still have some border on the outside. And as we go up 720, 960, and then because of the size of our browser, we're way up here at extra large or greater than 1200 pixels with a max width of 1140. And because our screen is actually 1280, that's why we get those fairly large gutters on the outside. So any CSS that we want to change the way it works, we don't have to get into the Bootstrap source code and start tweaking elements. There are ways to do that and even compile your own Bootstrap if you really want to dig in that way. But the best way really is to define your own CSS and include it after the Bootstrap CSS. You can really override any of this. The other way to theme your website is to use templates or themes that you can get over the internet. Instead of showing you all different theme sites, I'm going to start with one that I quite like called Bootswatch. Bootswatch has a bunch of just very thin themes. This basically changes colors and fonts and roundedness of buttons, and it just requires a simple CSS to be included in your project. And you can see it has a number of these. And if you wanted a more complete rewrite of what you're doing over Bootstrap, they do have links over to some other sites that actually have full templates. But these are just themes on top of them. So let's open up a command window, and I'm just going to do npm install Bootswatch, save. This will add Bootswatch and go ahead and install it for us. And then all we need to really do is include it after Bootstrap. Again, because it's overriding some of the Bootstrap settings, we want to include it here. So we'll say link CSS. And just like we did before, it'll be in node modules, but this time it'll be in Bootswatch distribution. And then you're going to see each of those themes included here. So let's start with Cosmo, and let's just grab Bootstrap min from Cosmo. Let's save that. If we go back to our Space is Amazing, we'll see that it's changed the overall look and feel. Not dramatically, but it's changed the fonts. And if we had used things with more color, we'd have actually seen that buttons have changed and some other things have changed. And in the same way, we just changed this to another one that we may have liked, like Lux. It's made a bit even more of a dramatic change. And then we'll actually end up with Cyborg, which is the one we're going to use for our project. We'll see that it doesn't actually look very good because we've got these fonts. They all look nice, but the background is weird. And that's because Cyborg is one of them that actually changes the background as well. And because we changed the background to this gray, we're still overriding what even the Bootswatch is doing. So if we get rid of that, we could change it later. We'll see that we're back to a look and feel that starts to really make our space images just pop really well. It's changed the color, the kind of fonts, even some of the ways we're doing things by just changing some of the CSS that's involved, just overriding what the default Bootswatch is. And if you don't like what it's doing exactly, you can still go back and tweak it with your own CSS. So one thing I want to encourage you to do is not just leave once you finish this course and apply all the little Bootstrap tricks I'm going to show you. Go ahead and think about making it a little more unique by using some of the themes or even templates out there to really take on a look of its own. Or pass it off to a web designer and have them write some CSS on top of the Bootstrap and Bootswatch in order to customize it to really grab hold of whatever your theming or whatever your branding wants to do. Let's wrap up this module. So in this module, we've got started with some of the basics of Bootstrap. We've seen how classes can help you make layout fixes in the way you want to do things by using padding and margin and changing the display of certain elements. I've shown you how critical the grid system is, and that using those multiple grid sizes is really powerful. It can be confusing at first, but once you embrace the grid of 12, I think you'll be much happier. Thanks for joining me for this module.